During the brutal conflicts of World War II, heavy machine guns provided the devastating sustained firepower necessary to dominate the battlefield. These massive crews served weapons anchored defensive lines, destroyed light armor, and shredded enemy infantry formations. This is the complete historical catalog of every heavy machine gun utilized by the major global powers during the Second World War. We begin with the United States and the Browning M2HB, chambered in .50 caliber. Operating on a short recoil principle, it fired massive projectiles capable of tearing through concrete bunkers and lightly armored vehicles with ease. The HB designation stood for heavy barrel, which allowed the weapon to sustain prolonged air-cooled firing without warping the metal. It was universally mounted on tanks, half-tracks, and heavy infantry tripods to provide overwhelming fire superiority across all combat theaters. Weighing roughly 84 pounds without its mount, it required a dedicated team to transport and operate effectively in the field. This devastating weapon proved so incredibly effective that modernized variants remain in active military service across the globe today. Next, we have the Browning M2 water-cooled .50 caliber machine gun. Unlike the heavy barrel infantry variant, this model utilized a massive water jacket surrounding the barrel to absolutely maximize sustained fire capabilities. It was primarily deployed in dedicated anti-aircraft roles where gunners needed to fire continuously at rapidly moving airborne targets without overheating. The United States Navy relied heavily on this weapon to defend ships against enemy dive bombers and low-flying torpedo planes. On land, it was occasionally utilized in fixed defensive fortifications where the extreme weight of the water cooling system was not a severe disadvantage. A mechanized water pump was often attached to circulate coolant during intense engagements, ensuring the barrel never reached a catastrophic melting point. Let us continue with the Browning M1917, a .1, chambered in .30 caliber. This was a modernized derivative of the famous water-cooled machine gun originally deployed by American expeditionary forces in the First World War. Featuring a heavily reinforced bottom plate and a modified feed mechanism, it offered incredible reliability during prolonged defensive engagements. The weapon fired standard .30 caliber rifle ammunition from a 250-round cloth belt, anchoring infantry battalions in the Pacific Theater. Because of the heavy bronze water jacket, a well-supplied crew could theoretically fire this weapon indefinitely, as long as ammunition and coolant remained available. Although eventually supplemented by lighter air-cooled weapons, it remained a heavily relied upon asset during major defensive stands like the Battle of Guadalcanal. Moving on to the Soviet Union, next on our list is the DSK model, 1938, chambered in 12.7mm. This massive gas-operated weapon served as the direct Soviet counterpart to the American .50 caliber machine gun. It featured a highly distinctive rotary feed mechanism and a heavy-finned barrel designed to dissipate intense heat during sustained automatic fire. The Red Army typically deployed this weapon on a specialized two-wheeled Sokolov carriage which featured a heavy steel protective shield for the gunner. It provided brutal anti-armor capability against early war German panzers and served heavily in a dedicated anti-aircraft capacity. Its incredible stopping power and rugged mechanical simplicity made it a terrifying weapon on the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front. Let us continue with the Maxim M1910-30, chambered in 7.62mm. This iconic Russian water-cooled heavy machine gun was an upgraded variant of the original Imperial Russian Maxim design. It was instantly recognizable by its large, fluted metal water jacket and the heavy wheeled carriage it was universally mounted upon. The weapon utilized a short recoil toggle lock action feeding from 250-round fabric belts to lay down suppressive fire. To prevent the water from freezing during the brutal Russian winters, Soviet troops often filled the cooling jacket with snow or a mixture of alcohol. Despite being considered obsolete by modern standards, its sheer reliability kept it in widespread frontline service until the very end of World War II. Next, we have the SG-43 Goryanov, also chambered in 7.62mm. Introduced in 1943, this air-cooled, heavy machine gun was specifically developed to replace the incredibly heavy and aging Maxim variants. It utilized a gas-operated action and featured a massive heavy barrel designed to withstand the immense heat of continuous suppressive fire. Because it lacked the heavy water jacket, it was significantly lighter and easier for advancing Soviet infantry to maneuver across the battlefield. It was typically mounted on a two-wheeled carriage or a versatile tripod that could be rapidly configured for an anti-aircraft role. The Gorion proved to be an incredibly robust and highly successful design, serving as the primary Soviet medium and heavy support weapon late in the war. Moving on to the DS-39, chambered in 7.62mm. This early war Soviet heavy machine gun was an initial attempt to create a lighter air-cooled alternative to the heavy Maxim. It featured a complex gas-operated mechanism and a selectable rate of fire, allowing gunners to adjust for ground or anti-aircraft targets. Unfortunately, the design suffered from severe mechanical flaws, proving highly unreliable when subjected to the mud and freezing temperatures of the Eastern Front. It notoriously tore its own cloth ammunition belts apart during operation, leading to frequent and catastrophic jamming in combat. Due to these critical failures, production was rapidly halted and the weapon was largely withdrawn from frontline service shortly after the German invasion began. Let us continue with Nazi Germany and the Maschinengewehr 08 chambered in 7.92mm. This was the standard issue water-cooled heavy machine gun utilized by the Imperial German Army during the First World War. By the outbreak of World War II, it was entirely obsolete for mobile infantry operations due to its immense weight and cumbersome sled mount. However, the German military still retained massive stockpiles of this weapon and repurposed them extensively for static defensive fortifications. It saw incredibly heavy usage by second-line troops garrisoning the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall during the Normandy invasion. Despite its age, when placed in a fixed position, it remained a highly lethal and mechanically reliable tool for sustained defensive fire. Next, we have the MG-34, specifically when mounted on the Lafette 34 heavy tripod for sustained fire. While traditionally classified as a general-purpose machine gun, this 7.92mm weapon fulfilled the dedicated heavy machine gun role when properly mounted. The complex Lafette tripod featured a sophisticated recoil-absorbing buffer system that allowed for incredibly precise, continuous automatic fire. When equipped with the specialized MGZ optical sight, gunners could deliver devastating plunging fire on targets, well beyond standard visual range. The weapon featured a brilliantly engineered quick-change barrel system, allowing crews to rapidly swap overheated barrels during intense combat engagements. This combination of high rate of fire, optical precision, and a heavy, stable platform made it a terrifying heavy support weapon. Moving on to the infamous MG-42, specifically when utilized on the Lafette 42 heavy tripod. Chambered in 7.92mm, this weapon earned the terrifying nickname Hitler's Buzzsaw due to its astonishing rate of over 1,200 rounds per minute. Like its predecessor, mounting this weapon on the heavy recoil-dampening tripod elevated it from a squad-level weapon to a true heavy machine gun. The tripod mount allowed for deeply sustained, suppressive fire, anchoring German defensive lines on both the eastern and western fronts. Utilizing heavily stamped sheet metal construction, it was vastly cheaper and faster to produce than the highly machined MG-34. The sheer volume of fire it produced required crews to carry massive amounts of ammunition and dozens of spare barrels to prevent catastrophic overheating. Let us continue with the MG-37T, which was a captured Czechoslovakian ZB-53, heavily utilized by the German Waffen-SS. Chambered in 7.92mm, this air-cooled weapon was widely considered one of the finest heavy machine guns ever produced. After the occupation of Czechoslovakia, the German war machine immediately absorbed these exceptional weapons into their own military arsenals. It featured a selectable rate of fire and an incredibly robust heavy barrel that provided excellent sustained fire capabilities without a water jacket. The SS units prized this weapon for its absolute reliability and its heavy, stable tripod mount during complex defensive operations. It was also heavily utilized as a primary armament in many early war German armored vehicles and command tanks. Next, we have the MG-131, originally a 13mm aircraft weapon converted to heavy infantry ground mounts late in the war. Initially engineered to defend Luftwaffe bombers against Allied fighter planes, it fired heavy explosive and armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. As the German war effort collapsed and desperate material shortages arose, the military began stripping these heavy guns from destroyed or grounded aircraft. They were retrofitted with improvised bipods, shoulder stocks, and heavy infantry tripods for desperate use by ground forces. The massive 13mm projectile provided devastating anti-materiel and anti-personnel capabilities against advancing Allied infantry. However, the electrical priming systems originally designed for aircraft use made them highly temperamental and difficult to maintain in the muddy trenches. Moving on to Great Britain and the Commonwealth, we have the Vickers Mark I, chambered in the standard .303 caliber. This water-cooled heavy machine gun is widely celebrated as one of the most rugged and reliable firearms in military history. Operating on a toggle-lock short recoil action, it was famous for its ability to fire tens of thousands of rounds continuously without suffering a mechanical failure. It was the absolute backbone of British and Commonwealth heavy infantry support, serving faithfully in every major theater of the Second World War. The weapon fed from 250-round canvas belts and required a heavily trained crew to transport the gun, tripod, water, and ammunition. Utilizing an adjustable dial sight, skilled Vickers crews could execute highly complex indirect plunging fire over hills and physical obstacles. Let us continue with the Vickers 50-inch machine gun, chambered in 12.7mm. This weapon was essentially an upscaled, heavy-duty version of the standard water-cooled Vickers, designed to fire a significantly larger projectile. It was primarily adopted by the British Royal Navy as a dedicated anti-aircraft weapon on destroyers, cruisers, and light patrol boats. In the early stages of the war, it was also mounted on various British armored fighting vehicles and light tanks for anti-armor capabilities. However, its rate of fire and ballistic performance were eventually deemed insufficient compared to the American Browning 50 caliber weapons. Consequently, it saw limited infantry use and was gradually phased out of frontline combat roles as Lend-Lease equipment became widely available. Next, we have the heavy variant of the Buzzsaw machine gun, chambered in 15mm. This was a British licensed and highly modified derivative of the Czechoslovakian ZB-53 design. While the smaller caliber versions were heavily used in British tanks, the 15mm heavy variant was specifically intended to destroy enemy light armor. It operated via a gas piston system and fed from large metal belts, offering a highly reliable air-cooled alternative to water-cooled systems. It was primarily mounted on British armored cars and early war light tanks to provide a heavy punching capability against mechanized reconnaissance units. Despite its excellent design, the unusual 15mm ammunition proved logistically difficult to supply, leading to its gradual replacement by more standardized weapons. Moving on to Imperial Japan. Next on our list is the Type 92 heavy machine gun, chambered in 7.7mm. Allied forces famously nicknamed this weapon the Woodpecker due to its distinctively slow and rhythmic rate of fire. It was an air-cooled weapon that operated utilizing a gas piston system, and it was universally mounted on a heavy, uniquely designed tripod. The weapon fed from rigid 30-round metal strips, which required a dedicated assistant gunner to constantly insert new strips to maintain continuous fire. To ensure the weapon extracted properly, it featured a built-in oil reservoir that actively lubricated every single cartridge before it entered the firing chamber. Despite its archaic feeding mechanism, it was an incredibly accurate weapon that proved deadly in the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater. Let us continue with the Type 1 heavy machine gun, also chambered in 7.7mm. Introduced late in the war, this weapon was an intentional modernization and simplification of the complex Type 92 design. It was specifically engineered to be significantly lighter, making it far easier for Japanese infantry units to carry through unforgiving jungle terrain. The designers finally eliminated the problematic cartridge lubrication system and incorporated a much-needed quick-change barrel feature. This allowed the gun crew to maintain sustained fire capabilities without permanently damaging the weapon through extreme heat distortion. While vastly superior to its predecessor, massive production shortages prevented it from reaching the front lines in sufficient numbers to alter the course of the war. Next, we have the Type 3 heavy machine gun, chambered in the older 6.5mm cartridge. This weapon was the direct predecessor to the Type 92 and saw extensive early war use during the brutal conflicts in China. It relied on the same gas-operated action and the identical 30-round rigid metal strip feeding system as the later models. Because the 6.5mm round lacked sufficient stopping power against mechanized targets, the Japanese military aggressively pushed to replace it. However, due to severe logistical and manufacturing limitations, the Imperial Japanese Army was forced to keep it in widespread frontline service. It remained heavily utilized in static defensive bunkers on numerous Pacific islands until the final days of the Second World War. Moving on to the Type 93 heavy machine gun, chambered in 13.2mm. This massive weapon was a directly licensed Japanese copy of the highly successful French Hotchkiss large-caliber machine gun design. It was almost exclusively utilized by the Imperial Japanese military in a dedicated heavy anti-aircraft and anti-materiel capacity. The weapon fed from 30-round rigid metal strips, or specialized top-feeding box magazines, demanding constant attention from the loader. It was frequently mounted on naval vessels, specialized tracked vehicles, and heavily fortified concrete emplacements to counter Allied air superiority. The heavy armor-piercing rounds it fired were absolutely devastating to lightly armored aircraft and amphibious landing craft approaching the shorelines. Let us continue with France and the Hotchkiss model, 1914, chambered in 8mm Lebel. This was the primary heavy machine gun of the French military during the First World War, and it remained heavily entrenched in their arsenal by 1940, operating on a gas piston action. It was heavily distinguished by its massive bronze cooling fins located near the breech of the barrel. The weapon stubbornly relied on rigid 24-round metal feed strips, which made continuous suppressive fire difficult in muddy combat conditions. It was the absolute primary heavy defensive weapon mounted within the massive concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line. Despite being technologically outdated, its rugged simplicity and heavy sustained fire capabilities made it a formidable obstacle for the invading German forces. Next on the list is the Hotchkiss model, 1929, chambered in 13.2mm. This was an exceptionally powerful, large-caliber heavy machine gun developed in France during the interwar period. It was engineered specifically to combat the rising threat of heavily armored fighting vehicles and low-flying attack aircraft. Utilizing a gas-operated action, it fired massive projectiles from specialized box magazines or rigid metal feed strips. The French military deployed this weapon extensively on early mechanized half-tracks, naval vessels, and heavy static anti-aircraft mounts. The design was so incredibly successful that it was heavily exported and actively licensed by numerous other nations, including Imperial Japan. Moving on to Italy, we have the Breda Model 37, chambered in 8mm. This gas-operated, air-cooled weapon served as the absolute primary heavy infantry machine gun for the Royal Italian Army during the war. It utilized a highly unusual feeding system consisting of 20-round rigid metal trays inserted into the side of the receiver. In a bizarre mechanical twist, the weapon actively extracted the empty brass casings and reinserted them directly back into the feed tray after firing. Like the Japanese woodpecker, it required an integrated oil pump mechanism to lubricate every cartridge to prevent catastrophic extraction failures in the desert. Despite its heavy weight and convoluted mechanics, when properly maintained, it was capable of highly accurate and devastating sustained fire. Let us continue with the Fiat Revelli model, 1914-35, chambered in 8mm. This weapon was a desperate attempt to modernize Italy's aging First World War water-cooled machine guns into a lighter air-cooled configuration. The complex water jacket was entirely removed and replaced with a heavily fluted barrel to aid in heat dissipation during automatic fire. Engineers also eliminated the bizarre original feeding mechanism in favor of a standard, highly reliable metal link belt system. Unfortunately, the internal mechanics remained extremely overly complicated, requiring excessive amounts of oil to function properly in dusty environments. This made the weapon notoriously unreliable during the harsh North African campaigns, forcing Italian troops to rely heavily on the Breda 37 instead. Next, we have the Breda Model 31, chambered in 13.2mm. This massive weapon was essentially a domestically produced licensed copy of the highly effective French 13.2mm Hotchkiss. The Royal Italian Navy adopted it extensively as their primary light anti-aircraft weapon across submarines, destroyers, and battleships. On land, it was frequently mounted on heavy command tanks and specialized truck beds to provide mobile anti-aircraft screening for infantry convoys. It fed from heavy, curved 30-round box magazines mounted directly to the top of the heavy receiver. The sheer kinetic energy of the 13.2mm projectile made it a highly effective tool against low-flying Allied bombers and fighters. Moving on to Poland, we have the CKMWZ-30, chambered in 7.92mm. This exceptional weapon was a highly modified, domestically produced derivative of the American water-cooled Browning machine gun design. Polish engineers meticulously reverse-engineered the Browning action, and rechambered it to fire the standard German Mauser rifle cartridge. They significantly lengthened the barrel for improved ballistic performance and upgraded the heavy tripod mount with highly sophisticated anti-aircraft sights. It was the absolute backbone of the Polish defensive lines during the aggressive German and Soviet invasions of 1939. The weapon proved so incredibly reliable and accurate that captured stockpiles were immediately issued to second-line German troops following the fall of Poland. Let us continue with Czechoslovakia and the ZB-53, formally designated as the VZ-37, chambered in 7.92mm. This gas-operated, air-cooled heavy machine gun is widely recognized by historians as an absolute masterpiece of interwar firearms engineering. It featured a deeply finned heavy barrel for rapid heat dissipation and an ingenious buffer system that drastically reduced felt recoil for the gunner. The weapon possessed a highly unique dual rate of fire mechanism, allowing operators to select between 500 or 800 rounds per minute. It was so highly regarded that the British military explicitly licensed the design to create their own heavy Buzzsaw tank machine guns. Following the German annexation of Czechoslovakia, the Wehrmacht absorbed thousands of these weapons, redesignating them and issuing them heavily to elite combat units. Next, we look at Finland and the Maxim model, 32-33, chambered in 7.62mm. This weapon represented a heavily modernized and brilliantly adapted native Finnish variant of the original Russian Maxim design. Finnish engineers masterfully redesigned the water jacket to include a wide snow-filling cap, perfectly adapting the weapon for extreme Arctic combat. They aggressively increased the weapon's cyclic rate of fire to roughly 850 rounds per minute by utilizing an improved muzzle booster. Furthermore, they developed a highly versatile metallic disintegrating ammunition belt to replace the easily jammed and constantly freezing cloth belts of the Soviet models. This heavily upgraded heavy machine gun was an absolute terror against advancing Soviet forces during the brutal freezing engagements of the Winter War. Finally, we conclude with Hungary and the Schwarzschild model, 1907-12, chambered in 8mm. This was an archaic First World War era water-cooled machine gun that surprisingly remained in heavy frontline service throughout the Second World War. Unlike the short recoil systems of the Maxim and Vickers, this weapon utilized a highly unusual delayed blowback operating mechanism. Because the action unlocked incredibly violently, the weapon required an integrated oil pump to lubricate the cartridges and prevent them from tearing apart during extraction. This internal mechanism resulted in a relatively short barrel length and a notoriously low rate of fire compared to its modern contemporaries. Despite being critically obsolete, severe wartime shortages forced the Hungarian military to rely heavily on this weapon during their brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front.